Lives Matter for Armenians. We will talk about the logistics of the event in a moment, but first we'd like to hear from Lisa Goudsouzian, who is currently a preceptor at Harvard University in Armenian languages, and who is going to give us a brief introduction to what Zoravik is and stands for.
Welcome everyone. On behalf of Zoravik, I welcome you to our event tonight. So you might be wondering, who is Zoravik? What is Zoravik? What is this organization that put on this event? Well, Zoravik, which means in solidarity in Armenian, is an independent, Boston-based Armenian activist collective, and it promotes new avenues for political and grassroots organizing for Armenian progressives. We're really based in projects, and so our project-based engagement is for Armenians who want to enact change in their communities. And it's not just for change for Armenians, but change for a greater world. We're all optimists in this group. So we welcome you on behalf of Zoravik, and we hope that you enjoy the event today.
Thank you, Lisa. Very, very nice to have you make remarks. Just to give a little context, Zoravik has been very committed to social justice issues, as you can tell, around the world. These are Armenian-specific issues as well as non-Armenian issues, and often at the intersection of those two. So for instance, we've been very active on LGBTQ+ issues in Armenia and beyond. But in this case, we are recognizing the incredible importance of this moment in history around the issue of continuing violence and oppression, violence against and oppression of African Americans and other Blacks in the United States, and of course elsewhere in the world. We're in a moment in history where, unfortunately, yet again, we are confronted with just how stark the level of violence is, how unavoidable it is. It's in our streets. It's in our streets every day. It's been in our streets every day for hundreds of years, quite literally. We are in a moment where people are again pushing for change and again making impressive headway, even though a lot more needs to be done. The question for Armenians, and we don't want to restrict this only to Armenians, but many of our audience members are Armenians. The question for Armenians is, how do Armenians relate to this movement? And the first thing to keep in mind is Armenian identity is complex. The typical image of an Armenian is as a white person. But the reality is some Armenians are mixed race, multiracial, and have complex identities. And Armenian identity itself has shifted over decades and centuries. In fact, Armenians were not white when they first came to the United States and later became white. And some of the panelists will talk about that later on and what that's meant. By and large today, Armenians are white, white identified, and that raises very significant issues of our responsibility for changing the situation in which African Americans and other Blacks, as well as other groups of people who are victimized by systematic violence, by police forces, as well as in the broader society, to think about our responsibility in that situation, and our need to be actively engaged with change. That's the origins of this event. And it is in that spirit that we're going to discuss these issues. Just very simply, we're going to have a number of presentations and discussions in the beginning. First, we're going to have two distinguished speakers give us some context on this issue, on the issue of Black Lives Matter, the civil rights movement, and issues of oppression of African Americans and other Blacks more generally. And then we're going to add in 4 other fascinating panelists who, together with the original 2, will address a set of core questions that have been coming up in relation to Black Lives Matter and its connection to Armenian identity for some time. Following that, don't worry, our very large audience will have an opportunity to pose some questions to the panelists, and we will reserve about 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how the timing goes, for questions from the audience. To register a question, please go to the question Q&A section of our webinar. Type in your question. Please, we know that there will be many, many questions. Keep your questions short. Keep them questions. We will then select out, representative questions. Often we'll get the same question from different people, and we will pose those to our panelists in the last part of the program. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator, Laure Astourian, who is a professor at Bentley University, teaching in French language and literature and specializing in film, if I'm remembering correctly, and who is another member of the Zoravik Armenian Activist Collective, and will also be moderating as well as introducing our first speaker. So without further ado, Professor Astourian, please take it away.
Thank you, Henry. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Aram Goudsouzian, who's professor of history at the University of Memphis. He's a historian of 20th century United States with a particular focus on race, politics, and culture. And he's the author of 5 books, including Down to the Crossroads, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Meredith March Against Fear, published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in 2014, as well as King of the Court, Bill Russell and the Basketball Revolution, published by UC Press in 2010, and Sidney Poitier, Man, Actor, Icon, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2004. Welcome, Aram, and thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for that nice introduction. Thank you to everybody who's joining us tonight on the webinar. My role in tonight's event is to try to provide a little bit of historical background by discussing how historians have framed both the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. And by doing this, I hope that it will shed some light on its applicability for today, and especially for thinking about what progressive politics can look like today. The civil rights movement can teach us perhaps some important lessons in that regard. So in thinking about this framing, how historians have interpreted the civil rights movement, right? In some ways, there are sort of 2 big drafts in this history. The first draft of history, really growing out of what journalists had reported on the civil rights movement, is in many ways the vision of the civil rights movement that most of us hold in our head today. To characterize it in terms of geography, we'd be thinking about the United States South, the Deep South in particular, where many of these important actions of the civil rights movement took place. We'd think of mass demonstrations. Think about the March on Washington, think about the Birmingham campaign when people were getting hit by fire hoses and marching through the streets of Birmingham, Alabama. Think about the iconic Selma to Montgomery march as just some of the few examples of these sort of mass nonviolent campaigns. And that speaks to another characteristic in terms of how we think about the civil rights movement that is very dramatic, that it posits sort of heroic nonviolent activists against brutal Southern racists. It brings together a lot of news coverage. It stokes the conscience of the entire country, and it leads to legislation, right? It's a very personality-centered type of story, right? One that often revolves around important figures, especially, of course, Martin Luther King. And thus the story often revolves around those figures, right? And that shapes how we date the civil rights movement. It shapes how we classify it as a historical period, right? In many ways, we see it beginning with the rise of Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott in the middle of the 1950s. And we see the story ending with him in Memphis getting assassinated in 1968. It's also in this framing again, that it's kind of told as a triumphant story, that we overcame Jim Crow, that we overcame legal segregation, and we passed important federal legislation, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which led to the widespread desegregation of facilities and got rid of legal Jim Crow, got rid of legal segregation. And the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which created federal measures that protected the Black right to vote and encouraged African-American voter registration, and thus began the political transformation of the American South in that way. The bad guy in this story, so to speak, what ends the civil rights movement is this notion of Black power, right? This new political philosophy that comes to the fore in the late 1960s that is more centered around Black empowerment, that doesn't have much use for whites, including white liberals, and that sort of splits the movement as it's commonly told. So that's sort of the old civil rights history, right? That's the traditional tale that's told. What historians have done in the last couple generations of scholarship is try to tell a new story, to complicate that story. If you just think about geographically, it's not just about the South, but it encompasses the entire nation. There's much more that unites African Americans in the Mississippi Delta with those in Chicago than divides them. They share many of the same concerns. They all engage in political activity in the same era and towards the same kinds of ends. not just toward desegregating facilities, but also toward jobs, toward better housing, toward political power as a means to an end, as a means to improving their lives. It's also international in scope, and that can be important for us to think about today as well, right? African Americans are paying attention to what is going on around the world and using it as political tools. That includes the Cold War. If you think about the NAACP and its legal briefs, arguing for the Brown v. Board of Education decision, it explicitly talks about the nature of the Cold War and how the United States is supposed to be promoting democracy to the world. It also encompasses African independence movements. In 1960 and 1961, many African nations were becoming independent, shedding off colonialism, and that was an inspiration to African Americans. This new cast of civil rights history also creates more people who are part of the civil rights movement. It expands the cast of activists, if you will. A lot of historians do these local studies where they look at one community and see what the civil rights movement looked like there. And what they find is that the story doesn't revolve around Martin Luther King. It doesn't revolve around nonviolent mass demonstrations. It revolves around local people, and that includes especially lots of women. There are more women who are active in the civil rights movement probably than men are. And it changes how we think of political action, not just those who are marching on the front lines, but those who support the movement. It helps us think about radicals. Think about someone like Malcolm X and his influence on African-American political thought in the 60s. It can even help us think about conservatives. James Meredith, the man who integrated the University of Mississippi in 1962 through his courage and his bravery and his sort of singular will to do this, in many ways defined himself as a conservative. So it expands who can be part of the civil rights movement. This also changes the whole time frame of the civil rights movement. If we don't center it around 1955 to 1968, if we look at the roots, what brings people to that moment, and we look at the trails that it leaves, we see what some historians call a long civil rights movement, right? And that's important for us because it means that we're not just confining the civil rights movement to this one particular period, but helping think about how it connects us to the present day. And finally, in sort of this vision, if you think about Black power, it is not just the bad guy, so to speak, but also kind of a very affirmative voice. If you think about how Black people themselves often discussed Black power, it was a source of strength. It was a source of a way to control their own communities, a way to express pride in themselves, a way to shed off white supremacy in a different kind of way. So this old civil rights history, this new civil rights history, right? They're not at odds with each other necessarily, right? There's truth to both of them, right? There is a lot of importance that we can draw from that older traditional tale of the civil rights movement. People at that time recognized they were living through this really important historical moment, through this huge sea change. And I think ways that people will recognize 2020 and will recognize this era. The civil rights movement of that sort of traditional cast can also tell us a lot and be very important for progressives in thinking about how do you build a political coalition that's bigger than just yourselves, right? Because how does a local movement that starts in a small town in Mississippi and a few people trying to register to vote in Selma, how does that become a national mass phenomenon that changes the status of African Americans in this country? But the new civil rights movement history, right? This new idea of trying to expand the frame of the civil rights movement, that connects the movement to us today. It takes it out of the sort of the dustbins of history. It expands who the movement belongs to. And it emphasizes that this movement continues, that this isn't something that was just of the distant past, but something that belongs to us as Americans today. In my remaining time, I'll just a couple quick historical examples. Think about, for instance, particularly with the passing of John Lewis. Recently, there's been a lot of attention paid to the Selma to Montgomery march and of course the violence at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So think about Selma as sort of one key example, right? We all know that story as nonviolent activists crossing the bridge and then getting attacked by Alabama police, and that leading to this big march finally to Montgomery, and that helps lead to the passage of that Voting Rights Act in 1965, right? But go back. Before there was a passage of the Voting Rights Act, you needed to mobilize a large number of Black people in the town of Selma, Alabama. To do that, they brought in people like Martin Luther King of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which led these mass nonviolent demonstrations. But go back further. Before that, there was a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was less about these sort of mass demonstrations, but they were a civil rights group too, that worked on expanding the local leadership. They worked with the locals to try to help them get political power. And go back even further. Selma is in a county in Alabama called Dallas County, and there was a Dallas County Voters League of local people, mostly women, including this woman named Amelia Boynton, who became sort of a central figure in Selma's history. And this Dallas County Voters League was trying to organize African Americans in Selma, trying to register to vote. So the actions of these ordinary people at the very beginnings of this movement led to more organization in that community, which led to connection with the national organizations and national figures like Martin Luther King, which led to these mass demonstrations, which led to the big stoking of the national conscience, which led to the passage of that federal legislation that was so important. But it starts with people. Maybe that's where I'll end today. And hopefully that can provide a kind of lesson for us to think about. That the legislation that transforms the nation begins with the resolve of these ordinary people and builds levels of support. As progressives, we have to think all the time about how do you expand your mission? How do you expand your coalition? And this is maybe one way to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that enlightening and opening presentation and for giving us such an insight into the issues that we're discussing. With that, we're going to move on to our second presenter. And I've got a real problem here. There is absolutely no way to do justice to Dr. Rich Reddick. He is, I will say, the Sasunsi David of both academic and activist work around a host of issues. So he's incredible. He's currently the Associate Dean for Equity, Community Engagement and Outreach at the University of Texas at Austin's College of Education. He's been doing a tremendous amount in developing and supporting initiatives focused on equity, inclusion, and diversity for faculty, staff, and students in the college, and serves as one of the Title IX liaisons for the college and chair of the college's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He's a prolific author, both in academia and also, if you do a little bit of a search, in various publications. He's able to connect, and I think this is the highest praise I can give him, able to connect very rich and subtle academic thinking with the most practical political processes that are going on around us. And every time I read his work, I come away learning a tremendous amount. His work has been featured on such distinguished or through such distinguished media as NPR, the BBC, Associated Press, Chronicle of Higher Ed, and beyond. And we can't express how thankful we are that Dr. Reddick has joined us this evening. Without further ado, I would refer you to his biography that we posted, and again, his list of publications that we'll have available. But without further ado, Dr. Reddick, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Henry, for that wonderful introduction. Greetings from Austin, Texas. It is not too hot out of my tech right now, and that's why I'm outside, just sort of taking in the summer breezes. I really want to thank Zoravik for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I really do appreciate Aram's excellent overview, which really leads nicely into what I want to discuss, which is the contemporary context. And certainly one thing that seems really important to talk about as we're talking about this topic of BLM and the Armenian community is the issue of intersectionality. And for those who don't know that work, that's Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a legal professor at UCLA. And what Dr. Crenshaw has basically posited is that oppression works in interlocking sort of systems. So people don't just simply present as being Black or Armenian or women. It's a connection and combination of those identities that really present sort of systems that make it sort of impossible or very difficult to emerge without severe psychological or physiological damage. And I point you all to a really great TED Talk she did called Say Her Name. And she talks about sort of how our attention on things like police brutality has been somewhat distracted because we sort of forget that police brutality, in fact, does impact Black women. And so it's a really powerful piece. I will warn you that if you do watch that piece, you will probably break down. The emotion is so strong, especially when she talks about the fact that we're so often in conversations where we essentialize identity and we don't talk about the diversity and the combinations of how oppression works. So I think it's a really important point to bring out. And I will, as a point of personal preference, a 7-year resident of Watertown, Massachusetts, I moved to the community without knowing much about their Armenian experience. And, you know, there's a wonderful Armenian museum in Watertown, and I learned a lot. First of all, great food, but secondly, about the history of Armenia and also the genocide, and other things that were just not part of my educational experience. And so I think it's a leverage point for us as we discuss this, because in my own work, one of the theories that I look at is something I've developed, which is called proximal experiences of being othered. In my work, I look very closely at cross-race and cross-gender mentoring relationships. And as I talk to people who worked across those identities, something interesting happened, because I didn't want to do that work originally. My advisor is an economist by training and says, do comparative work, that matters. And so as I wanted to hear stories about Black students being mentored by Black faculty, I got to hear stories about white faculty mentoring Black students. And oftentimes when I'd present those or I'd talk to those people, they would sort of talk to me in disbelief and say, well, I mentor all students. It's not just Black students. I don't have that. And I never made that claim. But what ended up happening after hearing their phenomenological narratives, I got to understand that they usually had very powerful experiences in their lives where they had experienced oppression on some level, either personally, through their family history, or through people very close to them. And that became a point of reference for them. And that meant that when they were at an institution that was predominantly white and they noticed that they only had a small number of Black students, they sensed that it was important to check in with those folks and just to see what the experience was like. It was always very open-ended. It was never presumptive that you're having problems, but it was more of a conversation. Is like, look, I don't know what it's like for you in this experience, but I just want to let you know that I'm here to support you. And if there's anything I can do to help you. And that typically opened floodgates because so few people in those spaces would say that. And so in talking about this, whether it's an identity of being an oppressed minority. So for instance, I had people in my study who were Jewish or Jewish background. I had somebody in my study who was an Italian, the son of Italian immigrants, who could talk about oppression they experienced a generation earlier. I had participants who had siblings who were part of the LGBTQ community and said being that close to somebody and loving somebody like that made it very possible for me to understand what it was like to be on the margins. Probably the most illustrative one, I think, was the professor who was married to a woman in STEM fields. And his wife was earning her PhD in the late 60s, early 70s. And he says, you know, Rich, every time a student comes to me and says they experienced some form of oppression or microaggressions, I believe them, because my wife has told me every obnoxious, unbelievable story in her lab experiences. So I have no reason to doubt the students' experiences. If anything, the students are probably pulling back and they're probably doing a little bit of hedging about what they actually experienced. And amazingly enough, the validation, and that's something that a scholar named Laure Astourian talks about, validating people's experiences is a critical part of how we connect as a community and how bridges can be built. One of the things I learned in our sort of preparation session was the strife that's currently occurring in Armenia, and sort of never being isolated to a point to not understand that oppression and warfare and other forms of aggression are always at play in this world. And there's always opportunities for us to find ways to connect, first of all, through the experience of being oppressed. But unfortunately, as history will show us, and Aram, I'm sure, would agree to an extent, one of the unfortunate things about oppression is that often oppression teaches you how to oppress. The idea that oppression leads to some kind of liberatory spirit that spreads out has not really played out all that often in human societies. And so I think when I think about this moment, and I was talking to some colleagues, I have a very good colleague here, Peniel Joseph, just wrote a book about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And so he's gotten a lot of people asking him, 2020, is it 1968 all over again? And, you know, I do play a historian in a classroom, and we have this conversation. And, you know, there's some key differences. For instance, when I talk to people, and I've actually talked to a lot of scholars like Henry Louis Gates about the fall of 1968. And you had MLK assassination in April, you had RFK in June, you had uprisings in cities that summer, and that a lot of institutions of higher education immediately realized something had to change rapidly. And so the fall of 68 was a fall that looked very different from the fall of 67. And so as far as who was admitted to the programs, who was teaching courses and so on and so forth, was a big part of that conversation. But also this idea, and I think Aram did a great job of sort of talking about the details of civil rights. If you look at the Gallup surveys of 1963, civil rights had its high moment at that point. The march had just taken place, people had seen it on TV, people embraced the idea. By 1967, with the war going on and the civil rights movement definitely taking an anti-war tack, with uprisings in cities across the nation and so forth, the Gallup surveys actually showed that most Americans opposed civil rights. That shift happened in 4 years because it moved from being a movement of aspiration to a movement of reality. People actually demanding rights, not asking, not waiting in line for it, but pushing. And people like Martin Luther King, who advocated nonviolence his entire life, were pushing quite aggressively for that in nonviolent means. And so I think it's important to remember that was where we were. And so how we look at the moment in retrospect is interesting because the work of supporting BLM, of supporting the Armenian community, of supporting civil rights is work that we often sort of patch over really nicely years later, instead of realizing the work is daily, it's difficult work. It's work that requires us to really analyze how people are being characterized in the movement. Those who are pushing the hardest are the ones that are going to be vilified the most. Those who are demanding instead of asking for equality and civil rights and equity are going to be the ones sort of characterized as being problematic. Those who are demanding power and sharing power are the ones who are often going to defend against that. So just something to think about is just the power of narrative. How are the stories told? How are oppressors and the oppressed characterized? Who is complicit in those narratives? Whether it's our media, is our commentators, and more importantly, how can we recognize and imagine what stories will be told of this time a generation from now? We're living in that moment. And I think it's a great opportunity for us all to think about how will we talk to our children or people in the next generation about this moment, which necessitates and urges us to think about how we will act. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rich. That was excellent. And your presentations went so well together. So thank you. I'm already looking forward to rewatching this. So now I'm delighted to present our 4 other panelists, fresh, passionate voices, extremely intelligent. We're so happy that they are all joining us today. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction of each, and then we will get into our 4 main questions and themes of the evening, which we actually came up with in collaboration with our panelists and also in response to certain messages we received prior to the event. So one of our panelists is Kohar Avakian, who is a PhD candidate in American Studies at Yale University. Kohar is originally from Worcester, Massachusetts, and she graduated from Dartmouth College in 2017 with a BA in History, modified with Native American Studies. Our next speaker is Levon Brunson, an Armenian Black American living in Newton, Massachusetts. He's a rising senior at Brown University studying computer science, and he intends to pursue a career in software development upon graduation. Our next speaker is Anais DerSimonian, who's a writer and filmmaker interested in the relationship between culture, media, and education. She's a Clark University alumna, 2017, who studied culture studies and screen studies with an emphasis on education. Our next speaker is Carene Mekertichyan, an actress, writer, singer, educator, and proud Angelina. She received her training from Dartmouth College and the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. She explores her activism through storytelling and works to empower young voices as a teaching artist. Before we begin the discussion, let me mention that with the help of Christine Gharibian and Laure Astourian, we have compiled not only the excellent pieces and op-eds of our speakers today, but also other resources on the website armeniansforblacklives.org. So you can check those out later. But first, let me begin with our first theme question. And here it is. Armenia is clearly in crisis this week. How do these issues connect? And what would you respond to someone who says Armenians should focus solely on the crisis in Armenia and Artsakh and not other issues as well, such as Black Lives Matter? And I know that we have one speaker who is particularly eager to answer this question, and that's Levon Brunson. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I guess to start, I'll just say that with what happened on July 12th, I immediately reacted in a way that I was thinking, is this still a conversation we should be having right now? Is the conversation about the Black struggle one that should happen given what's happening in Armenia? And to be totally honest, I thought at first that maybe we should postpone this and we should focus all of our attention solely on what's happening in Armenia. But the more I thought about it, I recognized that this isn't quite the truth. And I think actually just to take a step back, and for those of you who might not be familiar with what's happening in Armenia, at least at a higher level, I want to express that on July 12th, Azerbaijan broke the ceasefire we have and began attacking civilian structures, attacking villages, not only in Artsakh, but in Armenia itself, in the Tavush region. And they've gone so, they've been bombing kindergartens and PPE factories, and they've gone so far as to threaten to destroy the Metsamor nuclear power plant. So with that in mind, when I heard that and when I saw the videos, as I'm sure many of you have seen, of Azeris in Azerbaijan in front of their parliament, chanting death to the Armenians, or seeing these videos of them stepping on apricots and making all these crude remarks and especially all over social media, spreading misinformation, it seemed as if this was something that was more than what's happened over the last few years, in which they frequently violate the ceasefire. I was worried, is this going to be something more? Is this going to escalate into a conflict that is really just about the safety and future of our country? And I was thinking, well, what if this becomes an invasion? What if this becomes more than that? And I was focusing my full attention on that, because for me, I'm recognizing that I'm here, I'm in the US, and I'm a little far away from that. But if this did escalate, I won't hesitate whatsoever to go over and contribute and to help and to fight. So with that in mind, I've been doing it the best I can to support Armenia and Armenian soldiers. As soon as this news was coming out, I spoke with a number of other students in various Armenian student associations across the country, and we've gathered a coalition across the country with over 30 different schools, in which we've organized a fundraiser for the Armenian Wounded Heroes Fund, and to date, in 3 days, we've already raised $11,000, and we're helping purchase military first aid kits. So that's been the brunt of my attention, and we're already working on what we can do next to continue to help our soldiers and to continue to help the civilians there that are affected. On top of that, I've been sharing as much as I can on social media to not only inform other Armenians and to raise that conversation, but also to inform non-Armenians who currently or prior to this don't really know a whole lot about what's happening there in the Caucasus, and might look at this as just a border dispute or some vague land dispute between two third world countries. So I've been doing that, and currently my current process is writing another article about the historical and contemporary right we have to the land there, to objectively inform non-Armenians and to continue to bolster our own ideas, because there's so much misinformation that's been posted on social media by Azeris, and a lot of disillusioned ideas that are baseless. So I'm doing as much as I believe I can to contribute to Armenia, short of going there myself. And if there's anything more I can do, I definitely want to hear it and continue to be involved. But with this full attention I'm providing to it, I still feel as if I have more attention and more energy and more time to still continue to fight for and advocate for issues that are non-Armenian, and issues that, at least for me, are personal, because I am Black in addition to being Armenian. But even if I weren't, even if I weren't Black, if I were just fully Armenian, I believe if I'm doing as much as I'm doing, I still have time left over to continue helping others. And that really is the crux of all of this. Because if what told me this, what really got me thinking about this was recalling the Armenian genocide and looking at it as, why was no one else helping us, right? How did it happen? And I think about this a lot. I think how can you be in a world, even if it's not as connected as it is today, right? There were reporters from the US, from France, from Britain. How could people hear about this and not immediately rise to the call and go help? Well, they all had their own issues that they had to contend with. It was a world war happening. They had to, look over the safety of their own nation. And I want to emphasize that in no way am I comparing the Armenian genocide to what's happening today in for contemporary issues for Black people in the country. The point I'm making is that even more so, that the Armenian genocide, being as horrible and nefarious and evil as it was, should have prompted people to look past the issues that they were immediately facing and come and help, and yet they didn't. And that's the tragedy of it, right? Inability to look past one's own immediate issues and apply attention elsewhere is what breeds and what fosters the environment in which genocide can be perpetrated. And thankfully, we aren't in the position where that's something that's happening. But we are privileged enough, at least in the diaspora, to be able to provide attention to multiple issues. And using that privilege as just purely I'm not talking about race, I'm just talking about being outside of Armenia, being away from the border. We have the privilege of not having to wake up and fear for our lives and wake up and fight actively. We have the privilege of continuing to fight for Armenia, but also fight for those in our community who are also under attack. So that just goes to say, I in complete honesty, I wanted to address that, because for me, it was an issue that weighed on me for some time. I was thinking, this is such a big issue. This is the threat, and this is our country at stake. How can we talk about something else? But it's the recognition that we can do multiple things, and we're not just limited to one issue at a time. There will never be a time when there's only one issue to contend with. So we must continue remaining open to all issues that we can.
Would anyone like to add anything else? Thank you so much. That was excellent. Yes,
I'm going to speak to that. I can include that in my my response, but I think the issue that's being raised here is the question of allyship at large, and this question on what does it mean to be a good ally for Black Lives Matter. And I think that's the reason that why so many people have joined this discussion today. And I want to say thank you for the introductions, first of all, and thank you for everyone for joining at this time, because I know it's a really traumatic time for all of us in the world at large, but particularly for Black Americans, for Armenians, especially this week, as we know. And it's a hard time to show up. And I think that should be acknowledged. And I just want to thank everyone for being here today. But on this question of allyship, I think I just want to talk about this a little bit more personally. And this question that's been addressed by Dr. Reddick, by Levon, by Aram, I think it's important to show up for others in the ways that you've stated, but it's not just really important because we have the time, but it's an absolute necessity. And just more personally, growing up, it was really easy for me to, being Black, Native, and Armenian, to view these issues with the lens of my own personal identity. And in that way, I was able to realize that our divisions, in many ways, were coming from a lot of Western and white supremacist ideals that were imposed upon us in the course of us coming to this country in the context of the United States. And I know people are coming from all around the world, but I realized that a lot of the worst parts of our community, in my opinion, the way we judge other people on being Armenian enough, on ideals of purity and blood quantum, or colorism, on this hierarchy of those who are lighter skinned being in positions of power versus those who are darker skinned, in the ways that Armenian women are still struggling for equal rights in the mainland, but also in the diaspora, and the deep internalized anti-Blackness in our community. Those are all things and deep wounds that we really need to heal those, and we need to learn from those within our own community. But the fact is that growing up there was an indescribable feeling of being in community, whether it was singing or dancing, whether it was the way we viewed our family structure, the way we respected our elders and our ancestors. For me, that was clear, whether I was with Armenians, whether I was with Black Americans, and whether I was with Native Americans. Whether I was in any of those communities, that was something that it was tangible and it was unspeakable. And I think the feeling that we're feeling, being in community with each other today, we have to hold on to that. And that should be what is guiding your allyship. Because if it is something, if your allyship is something based on your desire to get others to show up for you, that's self-serving. And that isn't the way that you build real allies, because allyship means action. It means work, and it means showing up for others because you genuinely care and because you genuinely feel a passion against the deep injustice that's happening. And I think Levon and all the points that were brought up, the fact that the genocide was happening at that time and people are witnessing that injustice, which whether it was American missionaries that were in the Ottoman Empire or, different actors who were bystanders in a way and not really intervening. If you're looking at it from that perspective with social media, and this is sort of bridging into where we want to go next, we're witnessing really deep injustices here. We're being able to watch Black death in a way that, one, is really hard to witness for Black Americans, in a way that if you're not showing up, you're turning a blind eye to something that is a deep disease in this country. So it's important, as Dr. Reddick was saying, to believe people, to believe these personal experiences, because I know that tensions are high and that I think Armenians can definitely resonate with the feeling of not being heard and with feeling like even if these are family histories, many people can shrug them off and ask for evidence. And if that's your initial reaction, that's not being a good ally. Because it's the time to really listen and to understand that the work has been done for a while and it exists already, and it's time to really just show up for others. And I think good allyship in the end is listening and really just respect, passion, and love. Those are just the deep things that inform my understanding of allyship. And I think I could leave it there for now. So
great. Kohar, thank you so much for adding that very thoughtful answer to Levon. And I know we probably have other responses from other panelists, and we'll have some time to come back at the end. But we did have some other questions as well that we were hoping to get to. You've started to address one of the later ones, which is great. We got a head start. The next one is a two-part question. The first one, first part is directed first to Carene, but of course other people can come in. And this is, how are we to understand the differences between racism and prejudice? The second question is focused is first to Anais. How are ideologies of white supremacy and whiteness detrimental to everyone? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carene and then others as we go.
Yeah, so the first thing that I want to start by talking about, just kind of building quickly off of what Kohar was saying as far as allyship. I just want to say very quickly for the Armenian community specifically, we need to, as a community, Armenians who are white and are not mixed race and are not Black and do not have to live in the skin that we live in, I think it is very important that you acknowledge the privileges that you have, the way that you navigate the space, the way that you navigate this country and this nation. It's important to acknowledge the privileges you have and how you are using those privileges to uplift and center not just Black voices, but any marginalized communities. I think something that's very important to point out when we're talking about the Armenian community and caring about all of the members of this beautiful and diverse diaspora, it's important to point out that there are Black Armenians. We are here, you're looking right at us, so we are part of that community as well. So you should have an investment in our well-being and how we are navigating this space. I think it is important to talk about the differences between race and racism and ethnicity and prejudice. I've had a lot of conversations with Armenians, family, friends, who, when I'm speaking out about Black Lives Matter and its importance, it always seems to come back to, well, what do you mean? I'm not white, I'm Armenian, I've experienced a lot of racism, I've experienced people saying things to me and doing things to me, and I think it's important to understand that while you may have experienced prejudices, and we, of course, as a people have experienced a genocide, we have experienced losing our land that we are indigenous to, you cannot compare your experience in America to the experience that the Black community has had in this country. You cannot even imagine all of the levels of systemic white supremacy. When we are talking about racism, we are talking about systems that have been put in place to oppress people. So I always get into this conversation, not just with Armenians, but with members of other immigrant communities when they say things like, well, you know, the Black community, they're just kind of destroying their own community, or why are they protesting and rioting and doing this, that, and the other? It's their fault that they're ending up in prison and this, that, and the other. If you don't have the historical context for policing and where policing originated, as far as catching slaves, that's where our police system comes from. If you don't have a working knowledge of the school to prison pipeline, if you don't have a working knowledge of redlining and systems that have been put in place to deny housing and loans from Black people, there is so much in there that you will not and cannot experience. Armenians are a people that are ethnic, yes, and they experience prejudice in this country all the time. But saying that your experience is the same as a Black American's experience, or saying, well, why can't they just do what we do? And this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality, it's false. And it's very hurtful and detrimental to the current movement, because we need to be uniting. We need to be working together and showing solidarity with each other. I've seen a lot of people, this goes back again really quickly to the allyship question. I've seen a lot of people posting about, well, I don't understand, you all can stand up and say things for Black lives, but you're not speaking out about what's happening right now in Armenia and this, that, and the other. And that's definitely frustrating. But this argument of Black people never show up for us, Black people never speak out for us, which I've seen, it's problematic, and it's also false just from my own experiences being at Armenian genocide marches in Los Angeles, where I'm from, where I'm based, where the Black Lives Matter Los Angeles group has been there and has been out there in full force. You can even, if you want to go further back, like Tupac spoke about solidarity between Armenians in the Black community and the Latinx community. So there's a lot there that I think we can find we have in common with each other. And I think that's a very important place to start. Just making sure that you're not centering yourself and centering your own experience and looking at what other people are experiencing.
Oh, thank you so much, Carene. That was very enlightening. Would anyone else like to add in on that first question before we move on to the second one? I guess you've said it all. So we're ready to go to the second one. And again, this was primarily to Anais, and it's just the question of how are ideologies of white supremacy and whiteness detrimental to everyone? And I'm actually going to add a twist because I'm the moderator. I'm going to abuse my power for a moment. I'm going to ask, are they in fact detrimental to everyone? If you can answer that first and then maybe explain why you think they are, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Anais here. Thank you so much for having me. I do think that white supremacy is detrimental to everyone involved, even the oppressors. In a similar way that people talk about how misogyny and the patriarchy is detrimental even to masculine individuals, I think it's the same logic here. And while I think that we should all care about Black lives, regardless of whether or not it involves us, I do think that white supremacy harms white people. So it harms Armenians, if we're talking about it like that. Obviously, being white in America, we are granted financial and social benefits, but I think on a mental, spiritual, and emotional level, I think that being a part of a racist system is harmful and detrimental to all. There's a quote that really stuck with me that I heard one time that was saying, the two worst things to be are the slave and the master. And that I think sums it up for me. Additionally, kind of going back to what was said before, I think as Armenians, we stand for ending state-sanctioned oppression, in the Ottoman Empire, the genocide, and it continues into the modern day. But I think that realizing that as Armenians in America, we are white and we are part of the white state that oppresses Black people. This means that we cannot be passive allies, and we have to actively be anti-racist, or actively abolitionist, or else we can't truly say that we're against state-sanctioned oppression, just as a side note. But I think that sums it up for me.
Excellent. Would someone else like to come in? Thank you so much for addressing the issue. And would anyone else like to come in and agree, disagree, or add to anything that's been said on these questions? If not, we have plenty more, so there's no worry about that.
I can speak to this question just a little bit historically. In terms of our history of legal whiteness, one question I like to think about a lot. So to sum up, there were two legal court cases in 1909 and then 1925, Nuri Halajian and the Boston Municipal Court and US v. Kartosian in 1925, the US Supreme Court, which basically deemed Armenians to be white by law. And that does not necessarily mean that on the ground it always happened that Armenians were perceived as white, but structurally, systematically, Armenians gained access to whiteness. But the question I always ask myself is, what message is that sending for Armenian refugees that were coming here as a result of the genocide? What message is that sending to Armenians that that were already part of a state that was not only trying to annihilate them, but also was also built on a model of assimilation? For example, what message is that sending in them coming to this new state? And I don't think that, I think Armenians are definitely have benefited from whiteness materially, but I think we have to have these conversations about psychologically, when it comes to our trauma, what is whiteness doing to our communities? And what message is that sending for an already traumatized community coming to this country that was almost already literally annihilated from this world, what message is that sending for those who were already victims of an assimilative practice to come into this new space and then have to assimilate further? What are the losses there psychologically? How has that, I think we need to ask ourselves, the many ways that it manifests in such toxic ways in our community. And I think, as I already mentioned before, whether it's colorism and the anti-Blackness, homophobia, and the different ways that, as Kimberly Crenshaw shows, these are all intersecting, and we can't just focus on one piece of it. We really need to start to connect many different things, both historically and currently, and just look at this long trajectory to view things in relation to one another. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to add, like a brief historic perspective.
Thank you so much, Kohar. Laura, you want to come in with the third question?
I'd love to. So our third question, we began answering, thanks to Kohar's eloquent answer earlier. The first part was, what does Armenian allyship look like for Black Americans? And relatedly, and I think this is very interesting because a lot of young people these days there's a lot of activism happening on social media and awareness raising, and also, of course, a lot of spam and things like that. So a lot is happening on social media. So here's the question. What role has social media been playing in activism the past few months? How does the way social media frame issues add to or subtract from causes? And I see that Kohar and Anais both wanted to address these questions, so I'll let you pick.
I can go first. I just want to say that, yeah, like exactly what you were saying. I think a lot of activism right now, especially for young people, is Instagram based, is Twitter based, which is great because it's the spread of information is so quick and rapid, and you can get sources right there, get the links. There's places to donate that maybe you would have to go through other more tedious routes to find before. And there's real grassroots news. There's things that, as someone who attended quite a few of the Boston Black Lives Matter protests, things that I saw on Twitter, videos that people took on their cell phones that weren't aired on the nightly news because it didn't go along with the narrative of what they were trying to portray with the quote unquote riots. But I also think it's interesting to think about how social media sort of condenses a lot of information down into these tiny little panels. Like, for example, what is allyship? And then it's 3 panels, and someone drew like a nice graphic, and then there's some text, and someone can swipe through it in 2 minutes and be like, I understand allyship, perfect, like I'm an ally. And I think that can be really, it's a good starting place, I will give it that. But I think if that is the end of your journey about learning, I think it can be very toxic, and you can, as a young person especially, feel like you might understand these really big concepts while not actually grasping it entirely. Also, something I'd like to talk about that I know impacts probably all of us is the performative optics of social media. I know, as people who stand with Black Lives Matter, like for myself, like I post a lot on social media. But what does that mean? Is that the extent that, is the reason I'm posting to be a true ally, or is it to display to others that I'm an ally? And also I think, there's an individual level to that, but there's also a corporate level to that. What does it mean when a company posts a black square for Black Lives Matter, but when you look at their executive board, there are 0 Black individuals on there? So just, I guess I just want to be critical of social media because we're using it so much today. And also, one thing I would like to add before I want to pass it off to Kohar is just that social media tends to be an echo chamber, at least in my social spheres, because I went to a liberal arts college. Everyone that I am, communicating with, my mutuals on social media, are people who agree with me and people who I think have more or less the same views as me. So really, is that good allyship if the only people I am addressing with my posts and my thoughts are people who already agree with me? I think that part of the reason I wrote a piece that was published in Mirror Spectator was because I wanted to reach out to another community that wasn't just young liberal 20-somethings on the East Coast. I wanted to reach another community, which was Armenians. So think the echo chamber is an interesting thing. It's a lot of, putting a lot of effort into, sharing with people who might already agree with you isn't really going to spark change or, ignite a revolution or whatever. So, yeah.
Can I ask you a spontaneous question? What's a way to work around that? Because I feel the same issue on social media. It's like,
for sure. Later I wanted to talk about the word allyship and why I think it's a problematic word. And I guess maybe we can get to that later, but I think, I can just say it now, there's a word that I think works better for true activism, which is an accomplice. And the difference between allyship and accomplice for me, the way I understand it, is that when you're an ally, it implies that you are for a marginalized group. So you have this sort of like savior complex, like you are on the sidelines, like, yes, you are pro Black Lives Matter, but it's not really your movement. Whereas accomplice implies that, it implies with, and, it's your battle too. And of course, I think, there's this notion of allyship on social media, especially where it's like, I've done enough. I've posted 3 things today. Like, I'm good. I'm going to get off. I think if you make, of course, while still centering, if you're white, still centering Black voices and not, letting yourself become the head of a movement. But I think you can, without centering yourself, you can make it your issue. Like I was saying earlier, white supremacy and a racist system doesn't help anyone, I don't think, personally. So making it your issue while not centering yourself, I think, is the way to do it. I also think that there are ways to address people that, you probably really don't want to talk to, racist family members, people who are older, who maybe just, we attribute it to having a generational divide and maybe they're just a little more racist than your friends. But I think those are the people that, we should be having the conversations with. Of course, you should be in affinity spaces and talk with your friends and people who agree with you to get your ideas out in the open. But I think really addressing things when you see it, and if someone said something racist or slightly racist in passing, call it out, even if you don't really know them that well, even if it's not comfortable. I think that's part of it, is hiding behind your phone on social media. You're so comfortable. Like, it's a really safe space to be able to say something. But I think in real life with people that you don't know how they're going to react, that's how I would, that's how I've been trying to use my white privilege, for sure. Yeah. Any thoughts, Kohar?
Yeah, you covered a lot of ground. I don't have too much to add, but I think it's important to acknowledge also that we're in the middle of a global pandemic that is systematically and disproportionately affecting Black and brown people in this country. But it's also changing the way that we're interacting with one another. The fact that this is online is one thing, but I think it makes the fact that we're also in the middle of a pandemic is making social media one of it is the primary outlet for this movement. And I think everything you said, I definitely agree with that. And I would note that for a lot of young people, it's the first place that we're really seeing the news in real time. And I would say that is a really important thing for me, because even as it usually happens this way, I'll see the news on my phone as I wake up, and I use Twitter a lot to really get live updates from people who are undergoing just really deeply violent, really deep violence on the streets. And I think Dr. Reddick, you brought it up, that the voice of the oppressors is very often the loudest in the room. So I think when you're going on social media and when you're looking for your sources, you need to be actively seeking out Black voices and spotlighting those voices, but making sure that you're checking the sources and that you are, one, checking if their politics are matching up with their action, as Anais, you were just talking about, but also making sure that, excuse me, yeah, making sure that you're not just, that you're not just really performing, but that you're actually showing up for people, as you said. and that you're intervening in situations that I think people were just really being too passive in the past, whether it was a side comment, dropping the N-word. Yes, that's not allowed, and that is anti-Black. But in many ways, you know, the cat's out of the bag, and I know a lot of people in the past were very much okay with digesting their feeds on social media, and everything that they were digesting would form this sort of bubble of privilege. And I think that's broken in many important ways because of the Black Lives Matter movement on social media, to the point that we cannot go and retreat back into that space. So yeah, just continue disrupting that feed.
Can I add to what Kohar just?
Oh, please, please.
So wonderfully. Yeah, I think this is a really important moment, and I'm reminded of sort of the sequencing and what happens in these moments where something so heinous, which really is basically an expression of white supremacy in extreme form, that's been happening quite a bit. Let's take, for example, 2015 in Charleston. And I remember that moment really feeling and actually calling out folks who were accomplices, if I use Anais's terminology, which I love, by the way, and saying, you know, the stakes are higher. What you did yesterday that you considered to be the work, you've got to double that because it's not working, right? And I think it's these small interactions we have. And I think when I think about dismantling racism, I'm reminded of Beverly Daniel Tatum's analogy of smog. And that's something we all breathe in, right? White supremacy is something that white people, Black people, Latino people, Armenian people all breathe in. We've internalized a lot of these messages about our own selves, right? And so there is this moment where we have to be sort of humble in our approach and realize that we all have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn about the histories. And I love the discussion about social media, because social media is very beguiling, because my gosh, you can become woke and learn something in 15 tweets or a couple of Instagram posts. And the reality is that most of these issues are quite complex. So you might be able to have a cursory understanding of something, but you might not necessarily understand the nuances. And the problem with social media, it's not really designed for nuance, right? It's not built for nuance. It's not built for saying, I agree with point 1 and 2, disagree with point 3, kind of in the middle of point 4. And as a self-professed old, I kind of feel that I'm often good about amplifying or sort of bringing together ideas that I know about and sending people off on journeys, and also myself going on journeys, versus sort of saying the definitive issue is in 140 or 280 characters. Here it is. It just doesn't work that way. And so I think, just like Wikipedia, I think it's a great entry point, because I have learned so much just by, you know, looking at my feed and digging into something, and that'll lead me somewhere else. But that can't be the only place that people go. I think we have to really challenge ourselves to not be satisfied with having 5 people who I kind of have the same political stance as, and kind of just flowing with it. Something else that Kohar said I thought was really important too is this issue of action. What I've been really impressed by this moment of activism is that people are pushing back from the, hey, you know, we stand with this cause. People are saying, what are you doing exactly? What does your board look like? Who are you hiring? And I'm thinking about Adidas in particular. Adidas sort of out of milquetoast BLM piece, and people said, well, excuse us, Adidas, you haven't done very much on the side of hiring, and actually force them into the moment to actually step to that challenge. So I think this is a really healthy dialogue. Like, maybe for the first time, activists can actually get the attention of a CEO or of a corporate leader or an organizational leader and say, what you've proposed or what you're putting out here isn't enough. And let people, and now one thing about Generation Z, I think is really commendable, is that this is a generation that really has committed to put your money where your mouth is. If you say you're about these things, we expect to see results in some ways. And that's quite different, I feel, than some other forms where, you know, the term when I was in college was slacktivism, right? You sign a change.org petition and like, yeah, I've done something. People are like, no, we're not going to be engaged in engaging in your organization until you make changes. And I've seen that happen. I'll even say in my space of higher education with student athletes, you know, they are really finding, it's interesting too, because it's cyclical. And I think Aram can probably speak to this as well. You know, in the 1950s, 1960s, civil rights often went through athletics at universities because Black athletes would leverage their positionality and say certain things. In 2020, I'm seeing student athletes coming to understand that same power. I'm seeing them lend their sort of celebrity and their money-making potential to causes like BLM. But also I'm seeing the excitement about the possibility of intersecting, right? We can't talk about forms of oppression simply in isolation. And what's gonna make this movement, I think, thrive is the fact that it was formed by Black women speaking specifically about intersectionality of oppression. And if we keep at the forefront, this can become a movement that really brings in people. And I think ultimately, when I think about any great movement that sort of had resonance, whether it's anti-war or civil rights, at some point, people from very dichotomous or divergent backgrounds found commonality in the cause. Something about this cause, morally, politically, socially, resonates with my own agenda as well. And this is the important piece about the moment, is that we have to, and there's a great questions happening about how do we do the work. I think it isn't really, I think we ought to sort of figure out what that looks like for each of us individually. For some of us, it's going to be having those difficult conversations with family members. For some of us, it's like, I actually have a position in an organization where I can make changes, or I can sort of advocate for things that haven't been done before, or I can ask some comfortable questions. But I think the ultimate piece is really about us having the sense of humility, which means that we're going to have to all go back and learn and be able to take sort of the experience of being educated. Okay, I didn't know that. I'm being informed. This is one of the reasons why I'm not usually very quiet, but I'm learning so much from our panelists here that I feel really humble, because I'm in the space and I'm just taking notes and I'm looking at these different pieces that have come up. So I just think that that sense of wonder and awe and humility is what's going to make this movement strong. So I think if we all sort of embrace that and realize that we're not going to, you don't get to do this work and not walk away with a couple of, I don't want to say bruises, but, you know, a couple of owies. You know, there are going to be moments where, well, that was uncomfortable, or that exposed some aspect of my knowledge base that's not as full as I'd like it to be. But the point to me is to lean into that versus leaning out of it.
Thank you all so much. Great insights. And actually, Rich, you've done a wonderful job of segueing into the last formal question we have, which also about half of the questions we've been receiving on the Q&A board address in some way. So I'm going to make ours a little bit more complicated to integrate some of the particular features we've gotten from our audience members. So the first and I guess obvious question to ask, and you've started to answer this, is what concrete actions can people be taking, looking from the Armenian community and also more broadly? How do we balance local and national actions, or local and global actions in this process, where it's easy to sort of focus on one or the other? And also picking up Dr. Reddick's very astute point about the transition from victimization to other status, and how that does not necessarily carry with it a sensitivity to the victimization of others. How do we build that? What's the right way to do that transition? How do we encourage the right framework in that process, or for groups that have a history of victimization that's very present in their thinking? Finally, how do we build intergroup solidarity? Particularly if we look at Armenians, and there's some discussion about this on the board, but within the United States, primarily very self-identified as white, primarily, not exclusively, and often not just self-identified as white, but living within segregated areas, predominantly white areas, attending predominantly white schools, and so forth. And so how do we overcome those sort of very subtle but very powerful barriers. So let me turn it over to anybody who would like to answer from our panel.
Yeah, I can start with just a few things that I also had bubbling over. I'll try and answer as many of those as I can. But the first most important thing that I would say to think about is a lot of people are new to this. A lot of people are new to this form of activism and this speaking out. So know that you will not necessarily do all of the right things that you are supposed to do. Know that you might make mistakes. You might say something or do something that could offend somebody. But the important thing to do and the work that is going to be hard if we continue with this, because this needs to be a lasting change and a lasting movement, is being willing to take any sort of criticism or any sort of sharing that someone has of their perspective, taking that in, looking at yourself, looking at the space that you occupy and your own privileges, taking that in and saying, okay, I understand that. Now let's move on. What can I do next to help? I think it's really important that people in the Armenian community specifically who are white recognize their own privileges and the resources that they have access to. What are you doing with your own privileges and the space that you take up to uplift and center Black voices and Black people? And specifically, if your activism does not include Black trans women, then it's not good activism. You have to be inclusive of the people in our community who are struggling the most. The average life expectancy of a Black trans woman is 35. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think that the most important thing that we can do is looking at, what does our community have? Do we have space that we can share to our local Black Lives Matter chapter? If I'm someone who's distancing because I'm worried about COVID-19 and I can't necessarily be at a protest and putting my body on the line and between a police officer and a person of color, how can I help by donating to local movements? What are the ways that you specifically as an individual can use your resources, can use your privileges and everything that you have at your disposal to help the current movement? That's the most important work that I think you can do, just to start us off.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Carene. Would somebody else like to join in?
I'd love to further the point about extended and long-term change, in the sense that I think one of the most important tools for promoting long-term change and actually making things happen and breaking the cycle of this conversation that really does exist is the vote. But I want to make it clear that it's not voting in November for the president purely. Like, I think there's a weaponization along party lines in which people use an event or something and make it about achieving a vote in that sense. And I think that's made a lot of Americans, and this is not just about Armenians, this is the broader population, but it's made us in many ways lazy. And I think we've stopped informing ourselves, and we've become we've taken it for granted that we have a vote and that we have the ability to put in leaders who represent us. And I'm not saying at a presidential level, I'm saying at the basis level, I'm saying down to even like the city council, down to the sheriff in your district, right? We don't inform ourselves. We've vote along party lines, and we no longer think to ask, what are these candidates doing for us? We just pick a color. And I think that's, when one starts with that, it's perfectly fine because these people represent you. But we're no longer asking, what are these people saying? And I think that's the most important. And I'm saying that's why I mean at the city council level. That's why I'm saying at the who are we voting for mayor? Who are we voting for governor? Most Americans don't know when these elections are, don't know that these are happening, and we need to start by making this change. We need to start putting in office people at all levels, at the local level especially, that represent our interests and represent what we want in terms of making our communities better. And we need to remain informed and force ourselves to research candidates and to research what they have to say and to vote based on those ideas.
Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you very much, Levon. I think I'll take it over now. So that wraps up the formal part of the event. Now we're going to begin the Q&A. And our first question will come, of course, from my fellow Zoravik Coordinating Committee member and friend, Lisa Guleserian, on behalf of Zoravik, the organizer of this event. So Lisa, and please mute yourselves when you're not speaking, by the way. Thanks.
Okay, so wow, we had quite a number of questions answered and much information for me to digest. But there was so much in your presentations that I'm trying to still figure out myself. And I think the thing that really stuck in my mind out of these presentations is, Rich, I love Austin, I used to live there, but Rich, I have your idea that you mentioned about intersectionality, which comes from another scholar. I was actually very curious about thinking about this other concept that you mentioned about proximal feeling of otherness. So this idea that we can possibly feel the sort of solidarity with other people because of our own limited experiences of oppression, but that might translate. Sometimes it does not. I'm actually curious how, in the cases of each of you, we have a lot of panels, so 6 of you, all 6 of you have, ended up as scholars and activists and people who are interested in talking about these issues and telling others about your experiences, but also about what to do. And we heard a lot of things about what to do. So I guess my question is, can you tell us a little bit more about your journeys, personal journeys towards this activist or scholar positions that you now hold? How did you end up where you are talking at this panel?
I feel seen, Lisa, by your question. So I think I should go first. But yeah, I've really enjoyed this. This has been fantastic. And I do think one thing you've talked about, and I think what the concept of proximal experiences of being othered sort of addresses is empathy gap, right? So the first part of any sort of dehumanization process is cutting away the ability to empathize, right? If I can make you feel so different or present you as so different that things like somebody being in pain don't register, I'm well on my way to creating an oppressive environment. And that's kind of indicative of any movement that's happened to sort of dehumanize. And I know the Armenian community is acutely aware of what this feels like, right? And so I think I've often sort of grappled with this issue. Like I'm an educator and I taught elementary school. So when I hear a child crying, when I know the kid's not fake crying, my immediate concern is what's going on with the kid? Let's help that kid. And that seems to be most of us seem to have that wired in us. But then we start sort of getting messages from media or from family or from other sort of spaces. And then we start saying, well, that person is crying, but they are complicit in their own pain. That's why they're crying. And I think it's partly the experience for me personally. My dad was in the military. I went to 12 different schools. I was a new kid all the time. And so you learn how, first of all, easy it is to make somebody feel included, but also how easy it is to make somebody feel excluded, right? And that's been a driving force. And I have to also acknowledge the fact that my graduate program, I was educated by some fairly amazing scholars, because I always thought that people went to graduate school because they didn't know what else to do with their lives. Case in point. And I didn't realize that the ability to occupy space in the academy was not simply just something you did, it was a space of activism. And what I've learned in this part of my career is really figuring out, it's very important to do, and academia is kind of a mess now because everything we write is behind paywalls and you have to be institutionally affiliated to see it. But really finding spaces, and I think everybody's talked about this, how do I express the things that I'm learned or I've been engaged in a way that maybe somebody who is in the spaces I'm in gets to see, and vice versa. And so, yes, I do actually read what people write about what I write. And I was told not to do that. And I do agree you have to be careful when you do that. But I really am buoyed when I see somebody say, I thought I understood this concept, but then you brought in this other thing that I hadn't thought about, or I'm just troubled by this. Like, I don't think it's the goal to have somebody say, epiphany, I don't know things I didn't know. I think it's equally important people to say, I have to go and think about this. I mean, as a scholar, that's what my endeavor is. I want people to think about something versus saying, here are some pre-masticated ideas for you to just take in and put in your bank and just spit it back out. No, I want you to sit there and grapple with it. And what we're doing today, what I'm seeing on Facebook, and by the way, it's kind of interesting to follow the Facebook and the Zoom feed at the same time. It is pretty, there's a lot going on. But I do think if we've done anything, if we've troubled the waters, if we've made people think about, well, what can I do? And there's been so many things that have been presented as possibilities structurally, individually, and so on and so forth. That's the goal. And also to keep the conversation moving. I know we've all sort of pronounced or shared our information about how to stay connected and keep conversations moving. That's how we're going to get out of this. We're going to have to figure out ways to keep having conversation. As Carene said, when they're difficult, when we stumble, we've got to find allies and people to support us in those moments and saying, yeah, you could do it differently, but it's good you're in that space and doing that work. So yeah, I would say it's just being the son of an immigrant, being a new kid all the time, really sort of tuned me into this idea of, you know, being on the margins is not a good place, is not a fun place to be. And what can we do to make sure that everybody can be included in the space, unless they chose not to be in the space. And that's one thing we could talk about later on, but yeah.
I'm happy to answer the question as well, if you'd like.
That would be great.
Sure. For me, I didn't come to the study of history, or in particular the study of African-American history, from an explicitly social justice activist standpoint at all. I came at it more from the question of, here's where I think my Armenian background probably had a subtle influence on why I studied what I studied. It's that I was consistently sort of interested in the question of what makes us American. What does it mean to be an American? And that's, you know, as a child of immigrants, as someone with a foot in each culture, I was, you know, it was a way to feel more American in a lot of ways, was to study American history. And that's what pulled me into African-American history. You know, it was something that developed for me over time, that the more and more I studied American history, the more and more I saw that you cannot understand the nature of American democracy if you don't understand the African-American experience. You can't understand the American economic system if we don't understand its basis in slavery and in racist oppression. You can't understand American culture, which is exported to the globe, right? Without understanding African-American history. So for me, it's more a question, it's always been a question for me that there's a sort of fundamental grappling of where race and where African-Americans fit into the American narrative. So the kind of history I've tried to write has been a kind of history where I've sought to take people on their own terms, to not create sort of this heroes and villains and victims story, but rather to complicate humanity. And so it's been a little bit of a different angle, but it's in some ways it's ended up in the same spot, right? That Rich was talking about. Once you embark on this journey, then you start having to think about history as a means of empathy, right? As a means of teaching people to look at the world through different eyes, to relate these different experiences, to make these connections. So that's a short answer as to sort of how the study of history put me here with you guys today.
That's great, thank you. Anyone else want to step in? If not, we do have plenty of questions coming forward, so maybe we can switch over a bit. We do have our next question is actually from one of our co-sponsoring organizations, and I'm just going to make sure I get a hold of that. This is from one of our co-sponsors, the Hyphen Collective. Levon is the founder of Hyphen magazine, and Kamei and Gabby are on the organizing team as such. Only one of them, maybe two, will speak. So let's turn it over to them, and we'd love to hear your
Hi, thank you. Yeah, it's Gabe. Thank you very much. I'm Gabe McGallion. I'm one of the editors at Hyphen. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to all the panelists and Zoravik for organizing this. So to keep it pretty brief, we just kind of want to circle back to some of the conversations that have been happening in the Q&A and some of our own concerns that were raised. So bearing in mind kind of the environment of patriarchy and homophobia and hypermasculinity and nationalism that exists within much of the Armenian community, what we want to ask is, how can we navigate the sort of ambivalence or sort of contradiction of trying to do radical transformative work within the Black Lives Matter movement while confronted with the sort of inevitability or perceived inevitability of warfare in Armenia? In other words, like, these things cannot really be reconciled. So what alternatives exist to state militarism when it comes to showing up for both causes in a holistic way that kind of really bears in mind queer and feminist theories as they stand within transformative justice? Thank you. And I'm sorry, I didn't really address that to somebody specifically. Maybe impliedly it could be addressed to Levon, although I don't want to call you out. Although you did make that comment and it was discussed, you know, and we looked at that and stuff. So maybe you can start, and then other people who want to jump on that, obviously, love to hear.
For sure. I was just making sure. Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I want to really emphasize that I'm not an advocate for violence, and I'm really, the whole point is all about peace. And the specifics of this week's conflict are, you know, can be viewed in a relative isolation, because it's the only time, at least recently, when there has been credible and legitimate threat of escalating into a war in which the safety of, like, the existence of Armenia has been in question. The very question of the nuclear power plant being attacked that's something, you know, if that did happen, that's not just an attack on the power plant, that's an indirect threat to sending missiles and attacking Yerevan itself. And not only that, that's a sort of catastrophe that would affect all of Armenia and would reduce us to non-existence, essentially. So my comments about that, about going to fight and about being ready to do that, are not in the sense of trying to prolong a border conflict or of just advocating pure violence. In that sense, they're entirely contingent on the fact that this is a threat of Armenia's existence and kind of an invasion of land in which, like, really, if that happened and we were unable to defend it, there is no more Armenia to discuss. There is no more Armenianness to have when there is no country. So that's my response, and I don't want to seem like I'm advocating for violence, just purely for defending.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to come in? Okay, I guess that was an excellent statement. Thank you. So we're going to turn to some questions that we're receiving from the audience, in addition to the ones we've already referenced. So the first one, a few questioners have asked or posed the question of the whiteness of Armenians, and I think particularly for people with experiences that are outside of the U.S. in more recent times, they don't necessarily identify fully or entirely as white. And how does that, how do we look at that within the context of the U.S. and how does that complicate the issue in terms of relationship to the Black Lives Matter movement? And about Armenian identity in general?
I can speak a little bit to that. I know I grew up in a really, really white space in Maine, and anyone who I went to school with would not have called me white, even though Armenians are by the book white people. And me grappling with my perceived otherness throughout middle school and high school was really interesting. I was really embarrassed about my name. I was embarrassed about my immigrant parents, sorry, mom and dad. And just, I feel like I had this othered experience growing up just because there was really no one else except white Protestants, you know, like Northern, Western European white Protestants where I grew up. And then my experience going to Clark University in Worcester, which is really diverse, was kind of earth-shattering, because I had this moment of being like, oh my God, I'm white. Like, I had no idea my whole life that I was white. So I guess just speaking to that a little bit, I think that there is, no matter what your experience is, it might be different as an Armenian being outside of the US, being in the US in a diverse city, or being in a rural place like where I grew up, and your you know, relationship to whiteness. But I think it's important to remember for Armenians that in America, at least, we are white. We get to answer white on the census. And although people might be like, where are you from, or what's your background, we are still white, and we benefit from our proximity to whiteness. And I think just something to add on too, I know with other immigrant groups, this is kind of something to think about, but there's a sort of, in America especially, this sort of notion of, the immigrant notion of get in the country and close the door behind you sort of thing, of like, you know, really trying to capitalize on your proximity to whiteness. And there, I think that speaks to colorism in the Armenian community. It speaks to other issues in the Armenian community. But I think even if we are marginalized at certain points in our life or in certain locations, just to remember that we are white here, and that we should be using that privilege in a way that doesn't, that uplifts other people, and not try and capitalize on it or assimilate in a way that feels, you know, like we're buying into that racist structure. So it's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I just want to add to that as well. Speaking from my own experience being half Black and half Armenian, I remember a story that my mom and dad told me. My mom is Black and my dad is white. And she said when they were like first dating and talking about things, she referred to my dad as being white. And he was like, what do you mean I'm not white? I don't understand what you mean. And she's like, no, but you are white. So I definitely understand how we as Armenians how white Armenians don't necessarily see themselves as being white or as benefiting from white supremacy or your proximity to whiteness. But the thing that you have to understand, no matter what you may have experienced back when you're at home, I know my dad always speaks about all of the racism that he and his family would experience when they would be spending time in Russia, and all of the names that they would get called, and this, that, and the other. That being said, you're not going to be experiencing police brutality like Black Americans are here. You're not going to be experiencing all of these specific systemic issues that are built into the fabric of this country that was built on stolen land from the Native Americans, that was built on the backs of slaves. Our entire economy here was built on slaves and has profited off of that, and the fact that we have prisons that are for profit and profit off of prison labor. So there's just so much in there that is still going on, and that the Black community is dealing with, that I try to stress to other Armenians, you'll never be able to understand or experience. Why is it that we have Black mothers and Black women who are up to 4 times more likely to die due to childbirth? Because we have doctors who don't believe them when they're talking about everything that they're dealing with. So I think it's important to understand that there are specific issues that you will never experience as an Armenian in this country. You can experience prejudice and all sorts of comments and microaggressions, and you can even be followed around in stores. That has happened to family members of mine too, but it's just not the same. So I think that's the important distinction to understand.
Thank you, Carene. So I'm going to bring up the next question. Just want to say we have about 20 minutes left. So I think in about 16 minutes we'll wrap up. So the next question is, what is the role of racial...
I'm sorry, Sevan, did you have a follow-up?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, we have a follow-up because I feel like we didn't get that much time, and we did have a couple questions. So one question that we wanted to ask as well, this is something that I've experienced and have been like confused and thinking about, and like growing up in LA, I always got that like a saying that Armenians are the Black people of the white race. And I've never really I didn't know how to interpret that. So I was wondering if anybody here could talk about that a little bit, like the implications of that, like what it means. So is there any validity to it? Like why do people say that? If that's okay.
I think I could take a stab at that. And it reminds me of sort of ethnic enclaves, especially ethnic enclaves that have grown into sort of whiteness over time. And so Michelle Fine and others have written about, you know, whiteness as a concept, like how do people, and we know the famous stories of, for instance, the Irish. How did the Irish become white? Because they weren't initially, right? And so this is something, as somebody who grew up in Texas mostly, and moved to the East Coast, and I got to experience, you know, meeting people who had lived in communities like the North End of Boston and had been there for generations, and explained, you know, we're partly here because we have to be, right? Because oppression for us as newcomers operated very similarly. But of course, the key to whiteness is phenotype, right? So you can escape it at some point. And there was a really good point made earlier in our conversation, I forgot who made it, but about sort of, you know, how whiteness does require somebody to sort of basically homogenize their ability, stop cooking your foods, change your names, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then Bob's your uncle, you're white. And I'm simplifying it, obviously. But I think it says a lot about sort of the seductiveness of whiteness, right? And this is something that's interesting as a Black person who's descended from immigrants from the West Indies. Most of my relatives, when they come, especially my older relatives who've come to the United States, are very clear that they are not Black Americans. They're from the West Indies. They're from Jamaica. They're not from here. Because why would you want to affiliate yourself with a caste-like minority given the option? Of course, that's not how it works. You don't get to decide for yourself where you reside. It's decided for you in a lot of respects. And I wonder if that's the experience that Armenians had. And I think about how ethnic enclaves are established, and, you know, why is it that there's such a large population of Armenians in Watertown and in LA and different places, may have a lot to do with the fact that they couldn't be in other places safely, right? So I think there is something about that. So there's an opportunity to sort of embrace that proximal experience without over sort of doing it. And I think Carene made some great points about sort of, here's the places where those experiences intersect, and here's the places where they diverge. And I think one of the biggest challenges, and this is true of most BIPOC folks in this country, people have made great efforts to try to be part of whiteness or to escape Blackness in some ways, right? Legally, socially, and so forth. But of course, the legal, societal message is that, no, you can't do that. And we can go out to Plessy versus Ferguson about that, right? Homer Plessy was a very, very light-skinned appearing person, but yet still he found out he was Black. And there are stories about Indian Americans and Asian Americans and other folks who went through those same processes and said, I've done everything you've asked me to do. Well, your phenotype's wrong. You don't get to be part of this. And the experience for a lot of European immigrants was different because they were able to at least break through that. So maybe that's what it's about. And I would defer to my colleagues who probably know more about the experience, but that's just my 2 cents.
I can speak to this a little bit, or it's definitely a question that I think about a lot in my research. And particularly, I'm interested in viewing race relationally, which goes hand in hand with intersectionality. Instead of comparative models that traditionally, for example, would view different ethnic groups in relation to a white center, I think it's really important to have these conversations about how our own communities, like Black Americans, Asian Americans, and different racial groups in the United States, how our racial histories intersect with one another. We weren't all, in many ways, we were living in the same communities growing up. So it's really a question of space, of structural racism and different structures and systems in place. But I do think I'll speak a little bit personally here and kind of why I came to this question of Armenian legal whiteness. is that my mom is Black and Native, and my dad is Armenian via Beirut, Lebanon, and he came to this country as a result of the Lebanese Civil War. And in my head, honestly, I actually confronted the legal whiteness cases, that history in college. And I was pretty surprised at those cases. One, that I hadn't heard of anything about these cases growing up. Two, that even within our own Armenian community, we weren't having these conversations. And sort of, I think we should really take this time to deconstruct what that means. Does that, one, speak to our privilege here in this place? But I also think, and I do want to acknowledge the fact that I think whiteness in many ways does serve as a form of erasure for a lot of ethnic minorities from that region of the world, like Armenians, like Lebanese people, North Africans. And I think that's something that's also a separate issue. And in many ways, the United States, the way we really understand and theorize race here doesn't really allow for much space for a lot of these ethnic minorities. And I do want to, acknowledge that there is a lot of erasure there, and that in a way, whiteness in our discussions earlier we were having is not serving us in that way. But I do want to give a shout out to Janice Okumian, who was in Brown's American Studies program, or American Civilizations program, I think, in 2002, having these sort of conversations. And I'm going to just quote her. She said, "Borderline positionality has the potential to make powerful anti-racist interventions by disrupting the stability of white identity." And I also want to bring in the idea of liminality, which I think Armenians, when I first heard of the word liminality, I think it just really made sense for me. It's this idea of occupying this in-between space, of being in this third space, neither here nor there, kind of in the middle, and really straddling two words. And I think Armenians in many ways are kind of in this, middle in between space where things are very contested, they're very contradictory and plain confusing when it comes to our identities. And I think, one, you can be true to your own identity and your own personal experiences, whether you've undergone different instances of injustice abroad or in the United States. But then Black Lives Matter is also, that is the outlet for us to also understand that now it's the time to, recognize these privileges and listen to Black Americans about the structural racism that exists. So I think it's important to acknowledge that the erasure of whiteness is something that is violent, and often in a way that's very tacit, in a way that Asian or Middle Eastern Americans, and I know these terms are contested, but my dad is from Lebanon, and Armenian Americans in many different places coming to this country, the model is assimilative and it is one of erasure. So I think by having these conversations quite openly, we are addressing that erasure. And I think by being in a position, in this borderline position, or in this liminal position, that is an entry point with which we are able to disrupt that stability. But, so yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Laure?
Yes, so we have 10 minutes. Maybe we'll go slightly over, but we're already 20 minutes over. So our next question is from Hasmig, and it's, what is the role of racial capitalism in actively dismantling systemic racism? And how should anti-racists be informed in their practice and work to abolish, whiteness? Should I repeat it? I don't hear anyone.
Yeah, can you repeat it one more time?
Yeah, sure. Okay. What is the role of racial capitalism in actively dismantling systemic racism? And how should anti-racists be informed in their practice and work to abolish whiteness?
Well, I guess one thing that I can start off by speaking to, which I already kind of mentioned as far as racial capitalism, what I think they're talking about is how capitalism just in general upholds white supremacy and systems of oppression. I think one thing that everyone, just speaking to the pandemic and what's been happening, I think one thing that everyone is kind of realizing is the sort of fragility of this capitalist system that we are under, and how in this country, we're not protecting our citizens. We're not protecting our citizens as far as healthcare is concerned, as far as the fact that a lot of us are having to work and put ourselves at risk because we are not able to receive the unemployment benefits that we're getting. And that also speaks to the fact that this pandemic is disproportionately affecting Black and brown people. I know I can speak to being here in Los Angeles, and we still have a lot of our vendors and our undocumented citizens who are out working on the street day after day, working on houses. Their work has not stopped at all during this time. So I think that speaks to, there are a lot of structures at play. We can also talk about prisons and the fact that we have for-profit prisons. And that also speaks to the fact that we're working, I know in California, our governor has spoken about closing certain prisons and jails. We just recently got the LA County Board of Supervisors to close the Men's Central Jail, which is a very big win. Going back to something that Levon mentioned earlier about voting in your local elections, and one of the big things that Black Lives Matter Los Angeles has been speaking about specifically is the importance of a people's budget and defunding the police and all of these systems, because we won't really get the change that we want if we are not funding care and human-centered services, funding our education system, funding arts in our schools and all of those specific programs, as opposed to putting all of this funding into law enforcement, and which again disproportionately affects Black and brown communities. So I think one thing that is very, very important is to make sure, speaking specifically in Los Angeles, but I know it's similar in other places, making sure that you're calling into your local city council meetings, making sure that you're calling in and posting comments and doing all of that for your board of supervisors meetings and making your voices heard, because you directly have a voice and an influence on how all of the programs are funded on a local level. So that's how you can start to see the biggest change. And again, voting as well, all of that. But that's, I think, I'm not sure if I fully answered the question because there are a lot of elements in there, but yeah.
I want to actually just, I think you answered the first, maybe the first half of that. And then I think the last section of that was talking about getting rid of whiteness, if I'm not mistaken. But I want to say I disagree with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with being white, or that's something that should be gotten rid of. Like, that's just, the color of somebody's skin. That's not, it shouldn't say anything about the content of someone's character. I think the question should be saying, how do we get rid of racist ideas or racist decisions in these, rather, and that's I think what was being addressed and what the question is really about. But I just wanted to speak out against that and say that it should never, on either side, it should never be about the color of your skin. It's more about the experiences that you've had and how you're treated rather than the color.
I say we have one last question, and then we do our very long list of thank yous. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I know people are sticking with us, and this discussion could likely go on for hours, but that's also a great sign. This event is not meant to be a solution to the issues of systemic racism in the United States and violence against African Americans and other Blacks by police and others. It's meant to be the beginning of a conversation. So I kind of think it's good if we actually end with people still wanting to talk, and even more importantly, wanting to do more. So I think we can turn it over to Laure for the last question, and then do our thank yous and wish that everyone extends this process forward indefinitely until we really start to see the social justice that we've been, I mean, honestly, people have been pushing for 400 years on this continent.
Hank, I actually didn't pick a question. So
oh, you didn't? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there are too many. And
should have one last, but the list
as a testament, there are so many questions that have come up, and really powerfully insightful questions about the role of religious institutions, both positive and negative, but also positive potential. Questions about people who are disparaging the Black Lives Movement matter, even though they say they support anti-racism in general. How do you deal with that? I think we'll end on one that I think is more cut and dry, but I think also connects with some of the issues that have been raised already and may provide a very good moment of closure. This one is regarding the ability to look at multiple issues at one time, which we discussed actually quite early on. Many Armenians have a difficult time connecting to the Black Lives Matter struggle because they cite Armenian pain, right? We've discussed this. But this is a really interesting question. If Turkey stopped denying the Armenian genocide and made even symbolic reparations, do the panelists think that more Armenians would be willing to support other causes, particularly Black Lives Matter?
I'll try to speak to that. That strikes me as a dodge. That strikes me as a way to get away from answering the question for dealing with the issues itself. It reminds me of Martin Luther King. When he was in a jail in Birmingham in 1963, he said, he was accused of why is he there? You know, why was he in Birmingham? He's not from there, he's an outsider. And he said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And this is a guy who spoke out against the Vietnam War a couple of years later, not because it fulfilled his agenda as an African-American leader and fulfilling civil rights. Probably, in fact, it hampered that in certain ways, right? In terms of his overall popularity and legitimacy. But he had to do what was right. How can, as Armenians, if we claim to identify with oppressed people, if we claim our, a big part of our identity so much revolves around this historic oppression, how can we not stand with others in that same way? So to say, oh, once this issue is taken care of, we'll move on to other issues, that's a dodge, and there's no other way around it for me.
Great, thank you.
I'd love to further that and actually just say, even if we weren't part of a group that was oppressed and felt similarly, it's just purely, it's a human issue, right? And I think Dr. Reddick kind of touched on this a little bit. It's about empathy, and even if you haven't felt it yourself, it's the recognition that this is just wrong is wrong is wrong. This is a moral issue. This is morally wrong, and you should want to step in, regardless of whether or not you felt that, and try to right that. And especially with the consideration of Turkey, and like, let's say they did recognize it, then our next step from there is probably going to be trying to achieve some sort of reparations for that. And there's always going to be another cause, another struggle. So there's never going to be a time in which we can say, we're done with ours, it's time to go help others. It's a human issue. It's not just about Armenians, it's not about any specific race, it's not about any specific oppression. We have to empathize.
And I just like to point out too that obviously Black Americans have their hands full, but to every protest that I've ever been to, there's always pro-Palestine signs made by Black leaders. There's always pro-Indigenous signs, even with a group that we can see in America that has their hands totally full with dealing with their own movement, there is still solidarity with other movements, which I think is a great example for Armenians at this time, especially.
And one thing that I just want to add just really super quickly, just to think about in the future for the Armenian community is if you are in support, which we should be in support of getting reparations for the genocide, you should also be in support of reparations for the Black community. You should also be in support of reparations for the Native American Indigenous community in the United States. Just putting that out there as something to think about, because again, all of this is your fight as well.
I think Anais and Carene made excellent points that I want to completely co-sign on. If there is something to be learned from this experience, and it is this idea that we need to think about our interlocking experiences, and then also how do we leverage the experiences. I mean, people in our families died and experienced oppression, and we experience oppression to this day. And it wasn't done because, you know, just for our very narrow sort of set of issues we were working on, right? I think Levon made this really good point about just this need, the moral questions. So Gloria Ladson-Billings is an educational researcher. She wrote a great piece that's very short, and I'll see if I can drop a link in somewhere, but it's basically a question about moral debt. We talk about debt and finances and so forth. She talks about the American moral debt based on the pillaging of lands of indigenous people, based on slavery, chattel slavery of Black people, and oppression of people throughout history. We have to come to terms with that moral debt, right? It's something that is always going to, especially a country that professes, and this is what's so amazing to me. People will say that this conversation we're having is anti-American, but we are simply holding this nation accountable to its ideals, right? That was the idea. In another place, maybe this is not the conversation you would have, but in this place in particular, to articulate these Enlightenment ideas, but somehow live with the subjugation and attempted elimination of Native peoples and the oppression of Black and brown peoples and various peoples from other parts of the world before they entered. And I love what was said about the erasure that whiteness brings. It brings privilege, but it also erases so much of what makes us rich and whole. So I think that's what I really kind of gravitate towards, is what is our moral question here? And as people who often gravitate to systems of faith, whether they be religious or otherwise, it's a question that most faith systems have. What is your morality? You know, what's right, as Levon said, what's right and what's wrong? It's that simple. And I think that's what conversation we have to start having. We can start there, we can expand it, but let's at least operate from a morally consistent space, as Dr. King talked about, as Aram brought forward. Let's speak from that perspective, and that'll help us, I think, move forward light years in this conversation, because we seem to have these morally relativistic sort of positionalities. Well, that was okay because this had happened. No, oppression, subjugation, those are wrong things, regardless of where you stand politically and regardless who does it.
Oh, that's tremendous, all of you. I don't know, I know we could go on for quite a while, even on this issue, but I really appreciate all that you've said and the powerful insights you've given us and how much you've given us to think about. Before I turn it over to Laure for the closing, I just wanted to recognize two people in Zoravik who have done a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes to get this event to happen. Sarah Cohen of the Genocide Education Project, who is just amazing and relatively new to Zoravik. You can say hi. And she wanted me to make sure you know that we will be posting links on Facebook. You will be able to find information about this event. There are a lot of questions about things, for instance, that Dr. Reddick had mentioned in his talk, and we'll make sure to get what we can available to you. It's, again, a great sign that people are engaged so much in this issue. And the other is Zoravik DerSimonian, who is one of the co-founders of Zoravik and who does a tremendous amount behind the scenes and really stepped up with this program as well. So thanks to them. And I'll turn it over to Laure.
Okay, thank you, Hank. First, I'd like to thank all of our panelists again. We're so lucky and happy that you all agreed to join. And I think this was a great group and it was wonderful listening to you and learning from you. I'd also like to thank Zoravik Activist, just mentioned, Sarah Cohen, and Henry Theriault for their work on this undertaking. Lots of work. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank Lisa Guleserian, Kohar Avakian, as well as Anais Agabian and Carene for help with the press release. A very important thank you is to Rupen Janbazian for the poster, the eye-catching poster, which went through, I don't know, maybe 20 iterations. So thank you for your patience as well, Rupen. We'd also like to thank Talin Asadurian, Meg Babikian, Kanar Bedian, Danny Donabedian for outreach to co-sponsors. So while this was an event organized by Zoravik, we appreciated having the co-sponsorship of a long list of groups to having their symbolic support, in some cases, some financial support for the honoraria of our speakers. And so I'll list them: AGBU Young Professionals of Boston, Hyphen Magazine, Kuirigs, Armenian Council of America, Armenians for Housing Justice, Hybrid Magazine, Armenian Enough Podcast, Armenian Vegans of LA, Lernazang Ensemble, and the University of Texas Armenian Student Association. Other organizations who helped promote the event are Gallus and Boston AYF. I would also like to thank the amazing comedian Mary Basmadjian, to whom we reached out for help promoting the event and who did promote the event on her Instagram. Thank you so much. As well as Tiffany Petrosian and Daniel Nashanian, who also promoted the event. Two more things before we end. So two more thank yous. I'd like to thank Christine Gharibian and Haig Astourian, who have worked on this website called armeniansforblacklives.org. And if you go to that website after this event, you'll find op-eds, articles by our speakers, other resources where you can donate. Just it's going to be the place where we keep posting things. So it's in process, it's evolving, check it out. I'd also like to direct you finally to the Zoravik Facebook page. Most recently, we posted a statement calling for peace on the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. We hope you'll read that statement. And finally, if you're interested in projects by Zoravik, please email zoravik@gmail.com to get on our email list, and we can send you updates on meetings, events, statements, and all other activities. So on behalf of the team, thank you for joining us. We hope you got a lot out of this event. We hope you see it as a beginning, and we hope that we can, I don't know, now I'm tongue-tied. We hope it's a beginning, and we're very grateful for your presence today. Thank you. And goodbye.